Welcome to the Produce Moms Podcast, where we believe there is a produce mom in all of us. I'm Lori Taylor, founder and CEO of the Produce Moms. For 10 years, I sold fresh produce to over 300 grocery stores in the U.S. And today, my team and I are fully focused on inspiring people to eat more fruits and vegetables. This show is just one of the ways that we hope to inspire you and your family to eat more produce and live a better life. If you like what you're hearing on the podcast, join our community of almost 40,000 in all 50 states and over 30 countries by visiting theproducemoms.com/subscribe. And be sure to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes. Thanks for being here. Enjoy today's show.
Hey everyone, it's Rachel over at Melon One. I'm here to remind you that watermelon isn't just a tasty summertime snack, but it's a healthy option year-round. And healthy options like fruits and veggies are actually good for both our physical and mental health. To learn more, check out what Dr. Monique Aucoin, a leading researcher in the field of nutritional psychiatry, has to say about how nutritious eating can help you mind your melon.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Produce Moms podcast. And hey, we are continuing on with our podcast series that is in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month. We are recognizing mental health. We are recognizing the role that fresh produce and lifestyle overall has in the mental health journey. And what an expert we are bringing on today's show to share some thoughts from her clinical background, her education background, and I'm sure we'll dig into some of those personal life stories as well. But we are welcoming to the show today, Dr. Monique Aucoin. And this woman is, wow, what a superstar. So naturopathic doctor and senior research fellow at the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine. And she is one of the leading North American researchers in the field of nutritional psychiatry. So this is the field of nutritional psychiatry is the use of nutrition in the prevention and treatment of mental illness. So tune in, stay with us. You're going to love today's show. And it is time to welcome Dr. Monique Aucoin. Dr. Aucoin, welcome to the Produce Moms podcast. We are very thankful to have you on today's show.
Thank you so much. First off, thanks so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak about this topic. So thank you.
Dr. Aucoin, this is going to be a really great episode, a serious topic. I mean, I don't want to, we definitely, this is a serious topic, but one that we're learning, as experts like yourself come on. I mean, mental health is something that affects such a large percentage of the population. So I'd like to kind of kick things off today with this episode and you just telling us a little bit more about yourself, your professional background, all those studies and what you do now.
Sure. So I'm trained as a naturopathic doctor and I have a small clinical practice, but I spend the majority of my time working as a researcher. So for anyone who might not be familiar with it, naturopathic medicine is a system of healthcare that combines scientific evidence with natural and traditional approaches like nutrition, herbal medicine, and lifestyle counseling. And naturopathic practice aims to address the root cause of illness and to promote wellness. So there's a big focus on holistic, individualized care and prevention. My clinical practice is mostly focused on supporting individuals who are experiencing anxiety and depression. Mm-hmm. But then in addition to that work, I'm a senior research fellow at the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine. And my research work is a really similar focus. It's focused on mental health and in particular, the role of nutrition in mental health.
Okay, so Dr. Aucoin, your role in nutritional psychiatry is the research side. So tell us more about what specifically you do and what does that even mean?
Right. So nutritional psychiatry research is exploring the connection between food and mental health and how can nutrition play a role in the development of mental illness and how could it potentially play a role in the treatment of mental illness. So for me, it started back when I was studying naturopathic medicine. I became really interested in mental health and part of this came from a place of curiosity, but also an interest in how can we help improve mental health care that's being delivered. We know that, like you said, many people are impacted by these disorders, and there are many people who find benefit from the treatments that are commonly available, but there's also a large number of people who don't have access to therapy or don't find some of the treatments tolerable or helpful. And there's really a need for additional approaches to how we support people with mental illnesses, and as well as a need for prevention strategies. So a lot of my research in this area has been in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Laura Lachance, who's a Canadian psychiatrist and a researcher who's also really passionate about food and mental health. And I bring the nutrition expertise and she brings the psychiatry expertise.
Very cool.
So I'd be happy to tell you about some of the work that we've done, if that's of interest.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes, please.
So we've conducted some synthesis research projects that are an effort to search the existing literature and try and identify what is known about different research questions and what kind of gaps still exist in our knowledge. So we did 2 really large literature reviews, one on anxiety and one on psychosis. And we tried to understand, what do we know about how different foods, different eating patterns, different individual foods, how do they impact those disorders? But the problem was, after we finished the first paper, we looked at it and it was like 35 pages long. And we thought, I don't know if anybody's actually going to read this and if it's going to make a difference. So as a follow-up to that, we've sort of shifted some of our work into the area of what's called knowledge translation, which is work to try and bridge the gap between what we know in the scientific evidence and what's done in the real world. Because unfortunately, there is a gap. There's lots of new scientific evidence that's developed, but it takes a long time for that new knowledge to actually impact what's being done in the real world. So our most recent project, we created a patient handout using the results of that work that we had done. And we created this handout that talks about nutritional factors that are important for mental health. And we involved people who have lived experience, like patients with mental illnesses and psychiatrists in the project, in order to give us feedback and help us to create something that was really going to meet the needs of the people that were using it. And we published it, and we're now in the process of speaking to healthcare providers about the importance of dietary counseling and training them in an effort to shift the culture around the role of diet in mental health care. I think what's really interesting, you said at the very beginning, we sort of intuitively know this. Like, most people have noticed that when they eat better, they feel better, like physically and emotionally. But the problem is, it's not really reflected in our current medical system. So if you had a heart attack, you'd probably go see a cardiologist and they'll probably ask you a question about what you eat. But if you were to experience depression or anxiety, in many cases, the conversation of food isn't coming up in that mental health care setting.
Isn't that amazing? You are so right.
We don't have any good research about like really hard statistics about how often it's happening, but anecdotally, when you talk to psychiatrists, and we did this as part of our that knowledge translation project, they'll say that it just doesn't come up in mental health care. Right. And this is a problem for a couple of reasons. Like, on one hand, when healthcare providers are asking about food, they're communicating to their patients that food is important to their health and to their mental health. And then the second side of it is that offering dietary counseling to people experiencing mental illness is an opportunity to improve their health outcomes, because there's this emerging body of evidence that suggests that food and mental health are related, and that changing the way we eat can impact our mental health in a positive way.
So good. And I've never heard of the term knowledge translation, but I'll tell you what, Dr. Aucoin, I feel like that's what, someone like moms everywhere, we need that. We need the experts like you to translate that knowledge into action-oriented, like this white paper that you were describing, or the handout. It's like, yes, that's exactly what we need. Like, so much of the research happens and we don't even probably know about it, right?
Yes. There's this huge gap that scientists are sort of talking to other scientists and publishing work in scientific language, but the public doesn't necessarily have access to that. So it's great that people are making an effort to try and communicate science to the public and communicate to healthcare providers who often have strategies that have been helpful for them in the past and aren't necessarily aware of new research that's coming out or new strategies to approach the healthcare concerns that they see.
Right. Okay. I am so, I'm so inspired by what you've just said. And I'm really, one of the topics that I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into is this food and mood correlation, because you are so right with your statement. Like, anecdotally, we know when we eat, a diet that's nutrient dense, when we avoid, foods that are highly processed, greasy, those type of things, like you feel that your body feels very different after those two types of dining occasions. So tell me a little bit more from your research background, your scientific background. What can you share about food and mood specifically?
Sure. So there's this really large body of observational evidence suggesting a relationship between poor diet quality and worse mental health. And when I say observational evidence, what that means is that these are studies where the researcher is simply observing what people do in their lives and looking for patterns. So they might ask a question like, do people who eat a lot of sweets, are they more or less likely to be depressed? Or people who eat a vegetarian diet, are they more or less likely to be depressed? And they're looking for relationships in those patterns and those outcomes. The problem with most of this kind of research is that it can't tell us what came first. So if people with depression are eating poorly, did they become depressed because of the poor diet quality? Or did they start eating poorly because they were depressed? Because we know that one of the symptoms of depression is a decrease in motivation, and eating well requires effort and mental health. And mental health symptoms impact things like cravings. There's sort of complex.
Like as you're talking, Dr. Aucoin, I'm thinking the concept that comes to mind is the terminology emotional eating.
Yeah, exactly. We can all picture like the movie scene, like the post-breakup Haagen-Dazs or something. And it's a real phenomenon. Like there are animal studies where they take animals and they cause them stress, and then they give them foods that are high in sugar and high in fat. And we see a reduction in their levels of stress hormones like cortisol. So it's a real phenomenon that these certain types of foods help to regulate emotions. But the problem is it's a sort of a short-term benefit, but we know that long-term, some of these foods have poor impact on mental health. So it's kind of a trade-off, but you're exactly right. That comfort eating or eating for emotional regulation phenomenon could be what's driving some of this association in the research. So when we look at that observational data that says people with mental health concerns are eating poorly, it's we just can say that there's an association. In order to know if the food causes a worsening or an improvement in mental health, we need clinical trials. And these are studies where the researchers modify the food that people are eating and then measure, is there a change in their mental health symptoms? So this has been done, which is really exciting. So the first one that came out was a study called SMILES. And this came out of Felice Jacka's lab in Australia. They recruited people with moderate to severe depression, and they randomly assigned them to either dietary counseling or social support for 12 weeks. And the people receiving the dietary counseling had a large decrease in their depression symptoms. And I think this is incredible. By the end of the study, a quarter of them no longer met criteria for having depression at all.
No kidding. Wow.
So really, really impactful. And other studies around the world have found similar outcomes where improving diet can improve symptoms of depression, which is really exciting. One gap in the research is that no research has been done yet involving patients with diagnosed anxiety disorders and using a dietary counseling approach. But the exciting news is that myself and Dr. Lachance, we recently received funding to do this kind of study, and we are in the process of preparing for that trial. So that answer is coming. You'll have to stay tuned.
Well, thank you, and best wishes to you both. So when you, Dr. Aucoin, am I pronouncing her name correctly? Your partner? Lachance. Okay. So Dr. Lachance and yourself, Dr. Aucoin, are you, so do you guys partner on a lot of these studies? Or, I mean, because you are coming with different discipline and educational backgrounds, correct?
Yeah,
does it sound like she is more on the clinical, like patient care side, and you are more on the research side? Am I following correctly?
So she's a psychiatrist. So she's an expert in mental health, mental illness, and how to maintain patient safety, and how to, she's an expert in medication and the sort of conventional approaches to mental health care. Whereas my expertise, like you said, is in research, but then also in the nutrition side. I have a master's in nutritional science. And then in my clinical practice, I work almost exclusively with nutrition approaches to mental health care.
Fantastic. Okay. tracking and very impressed, and best wishes to you both as you embark on this new study. And we're going to have you, maybe both of you back on together to talk about it when you're comfortable sharing the results. But
yeah, we would love to.
Yes, we will make that happen. All right. So Dr. Aucoin, I'm just like, everything you're saying is, it's great clarity. And it's also, again, I find myself thinking this impacts a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like there's a ton of people who, whether it's the acute emotional eating, like what I was, kind of referencing before when you were talking about the different triggers, or maybe people who are like, I mean, the stress, the anxieties, like we know from previous episodes within this Mind Your Melon series, as well as just anecdotally in the lives we're all living, like we know that stress and anxiety in 2022 today for most communities around the world is heightened. So to me, it just further, it just further elevates the importance for the work that you're doing.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, any suggestions that you're comfortable sharing as it relates to healthy eating for brain health and the cognitive function. What does your background with the nutritional study, like what can you share with our listeners today as it relates to that?
Sure. So some of the top nutritional factors that I think are really important in supporting optimal brain health and mental health are things like choosing complex carbs rather than simple sugars, eating enough protein, and thinking about anti-inflammatory foods. So I can talk about each of those a little bit if you'd like.
Yeah, no, we definitely need to dive into them. Yeah,
sure. So when we think about carbohydrates, our brain is really sensitive to the amount of sugar in our blood. And we can all think about an experience of like that hangry feeling. Have you heard that term before?
Oh yeah. Well, of course. Yeah. I'm a mom and I've got a teenager and a preteen in the house. They're yes. Angry is a word we throw around often.
I have two preschoolers and they get hangry too. So, when we're hungry, when our blood sugar is low, we can experience anger. But people can also feel anxious. They can feel low mood. They can feel irritable. And there's this really significant overlap between those low blood sugar symptoms and, like mental health symptoms. And when we eat foods that are high in simple sugars, like white bread or white pasta, or foods with added sugar, like pop or sweets, they can be really disruptive to our blood sugar balance. And we can have more of those highs and lows in our blood sugar. When we eat foods like complex carbs, like whole grains or fruit, the fiber in those foods helps our blood sugar to be more stable and more regulated. And this can make a really big difference in terms of mental health symptoms. So I can share an example from my practice.
Please, yes.
So there was a 15-year-old girl who came to see me in my naturopathic practice. And her main concern was anxiety. She had quite high levels of anxiety. And when I asked her what she was eating, she reported like an average day, and it was basically white bread, white pasta, granola bars, cookies, gummy bears, white rice. That was sort of the whole day.
And you said 15 years old?
15-year-old girl. Yeah.
I mean, I'm like nodding my head. Sounds like it. Yeah. Sounds like the 15-year-old diet. Yeah.
So
maybe some pizza in there too, right?
Maybe some pizza, maybe. So on my first recommendation to her was just, let's get a little bit of protein throughout the day and add some fiber so that it's a little more balanced for her blood sugar. And remarkably, she came back and her anxiety had improved tremendously. And that was the only thing that we did. Just made some small changes to diet. And so I published it as a case report. It's published in the scientific literature because I thought, this is so important. And it's not reflected enough in the scientific literature. The fact that blood sugar regulation and food choices, things like steering away from those simple carbs and choosing foods that have more fiber, can have such a huge impact on mental health outcomes. So I love sharing that story because I think it's just a really dramatic example, but it's something that I work with all the time in my clinical practice.
Highly relatable too. I mean, I think that's a highly relatable story to, a ton of people. So thank you for sharing that situation in particular. So let's see So what's the next nutrient that we were talking about?
The other one I said was protein.
Yes.
When we eat protein, it breaks down into amino acids. These are the building blocks of protein. It breaks down into those building blocks. And amino acids are used in the body to make neurotransmitters. Have you heard that term before?
Well, I just started becoming very religious with my collagen peptide
Okay.
supplementation. So I have, but
okay.
I know that maybe not everyone does. So I want you to, believe it or not, Dr. Aucoin, I'm tracking with you, but let's please share your expertise with our listeners.
Sure. So neurotransmitters are chemical messenger molecules that regulate things like emotion. They regulate a lot of things, but emotion, mood, anxiety, that's one aspect of what they do. And low levels of neurotransmitters like serotonin are thought to be a major cause in anxiety and depression. And many of the medications that we use to treat these illnesses are focused on increasing levels of serotonin. In my practice, I want to think about, if your body is trying to make its own serotonin, let's think, well, where does it get those building blocks from? And it gets those building blocks to make the serotonin from protein. If we're not eating protein throughout the day, we're not supplying our body with the building blocks that it needs to make those important brain chemicals that are going to be important for regulating mood.
So good. So when we think about sources of protein, I mean, there's a huge push right now in, the mainstream food industry for plant-based protein. Does your research find any sort of, does the research vary whether it's animal-based, plant-based, dairy-based protein?
That's a good question. So I would say the literature, there's not a lot of research yet. I think there's probably a lot of people who are working on this question because, like you said, a lot of people are really interested in it right now. Mm-hmm. There's certainly evidence that getting enough protein is important. And certainly you can get enough protein from a vegetarian diet. You just have to make a conscious effort to do it. If people are eating a vegetarian diet that's like the rice and pasta and French fries all day, that's going to be deficient in protein, and that's going to impact health in significant ways. But if people are eating beans and legumes and nuts and seeds and tofu or other soy products, they can get adequate protein that way, if they choose to eat in that eating style. So I think across the board, no matter what kind of protein you want to choose, making sure that you're getting enough of it is important. There are some preliminary studies that have looked at vegetarian diets versus a more omnivore diet. And it's complex because there's lots of nutritional factors that impact mental health. Things like B12 can be low in the vegetarian diet, or iron. So there's different factors that might be involved in why we might see different impacts. But then the vegetarian diet also tends to be higher in vegetables and fiber, which is going to have really beneficial effects. So looking at dietary patterns as a whole is a complex subject in research.
Oh, well, yeah. And one thing I've learned from hosting the show and having so many different experts, from nutrition, medicine, science in general, it's nutrition is such a highly personalized topic. Like what one body needs is very different than what another body needs. But, I thank you for sharing that info and insight as it relates to the research around the protein. And then what was the last nutritional element that you were talking about?
Yeah, the last thing I think is important to highlight is inflammation.
Yes.
So, there's this really interesting body of evidence that's emerging about the relationship between inflammation and mental illness. So in the same way that if somebody has arthritis, they have inflammation in their joints, it seems that people with mental illness have increased levels of inflammation in their brain or in their body throughout. And one of the significant factors that impact inflammation in the body is the diet. So vegetables and fruit have a huge range of anti-inflammatory compounds. And different colored fruits and vegetables have different anti-inflammatory actions. So I love the emphasis within the Produce Moms about including a variety of fruits and vegetables. I think that's terrific, right. because they all have these different anti-inflammatory actions. So fruits and vegetables is one side of inflammation. And then the other side is the type of fats that people are eating.
The type of fats?
The type of fats, yeah. So some people say, fats are good. Some people say fats are bad. Really, the research suggests that some fats are really good and some can be really harmful. So the type of fat is a really important factor. Sure. So things like omega-3 fats, which are found in fish and flax have really strong anti-inflammatory properties.
Yeah. That makes sense why they are so highly associated with healthy lifestyle too. So that's good to know. What about tree nuts? I don't know if you know this, but the produce industry, we claim fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, and fresh cut flowers as part of our industry. So what about the tree nuts? What can you share with us on that?
So walnuts are another omega-3 source, as well hemp and chia. I don't know if that falls into that category. Also have some omega-3s in them.
Yeah, seeds. So good to know. And I do think also, though, as you're talking, I'm like, okay, some of these are items that can be very difficult for people in modern day, speaking from an American point of view, like American lifestyle, the food culture here, like definitely not mainstream items in our food culture by any means. It's not like you said cheddar cheese is a great source of this. But I also think, Dr. Aucoin, like foods that parents can really struggle to get kids interested in. So I don't know if you have any research on that with like children or any opinions even, but I mean, I'm just speaking from the heart here. Some of those food items that you just said, I'm like, yep, all difficult things that because the struggle with food goes far beyond getting our kids interested in broccoli. Getting them to want to eat salmon over a cheeseburger is another one,
So as I mentioned, I have two young children, and sometimes I resort to sneaky tactics. So things like we do smoothies in our house for breakfast, and I hide all sorts of things in there. So that's my go-to for hiding nuts and seeds that they're not necessarily too keen on. I think also when people talk about fish, one big argument people say is, it's expensive to eat fish. But I think it's important to think about there are ways to get fish more affordably. A lot of people are less aware about like canned fish options. You can get tins of oysters or mussels that are smoked, and I think they're pretty yummy. You can put them on like a salad or eat them with crackers, and they're really inexpensive and really tremendously nutrient dense, particularly the nutrients that are important for mental health. So checking out that canned fish aisle, it's something that people maybe don't pay much attention to, but you can find some really affordable options there in terms of getting seafood into your diet.
Agreed. I buy the salmon packets all the time myself and make salmon patties.
Nice.
Actually, just on the heels of the Lenten season, and I did a lot of it for our Fish Fridays here in my home. So, yes, all great tips, and thank you for sharing. So, I mentioned previously that I want to recognize, and with this next question, like I feel like everything's very personalized, as it relates to nutrition and mental health and whatnot. But in your research, is there any, like, when do we as human beings, like when are we going to notice that our brain is maybe lacking the proper nutrition? Like, are there triggers? Are there signs? Like, what do people need to know?
So that's a challenging question for me, for sure. Because I think you're right. It really depends on the individual, and it depends on the nutrient deficiency. If people are low in a vitamin or mineral or fatty acid or protein, that deficiency might show up in different ways. But it's also important to keep in mind that mental health symptoms, there are a lot of factors that might influence mental health for an individual. For some people, these nutritional factors are a significant influence in the development of their symptoms. But for other people, there might be other factors like difficult life circumstances or stressors that are impacting them. And it may not be nutrition related. So it's pretty hard to say. Right.
Well, I imagine that is that has to be something that makes it hard to find that control group in your research too, it's like, my goodness, it does. I don't know how you do it, but I'm glad you are, because we need that knowledge translation, as I mentioned previously. So keep at it and help keep us informed. And I really respect your answer to that question too, because it is hard to say, but I think that my biggest takeaway after listening to what Dr. Aucoin has said is, certainly those 3 pillars of nutrition that she mentioned, with the proteins, the anti-inflammatories, and the proper types of carbohydrates, like very much a takeaway from me as it relates to what she said, but also just the food and mood correlation in general. I think it's something that we can all keep top of mind, but in that light, Dr. Aucoin, following my takeaways, what's one thing that you want our listeners to really take away from today's episode?
So I would totally agree with what you said there. Really, my big takeaway for people is that diet and mental health are related. It may sound kind of obvious in the context of this conversation, but as I mentioned, in our healthcare system, this relationship is really underappreciated. Patients more and more are being are having conversations about nutrition in the context of physical health, but in mental health, it's not necessarily happening. And like you said, if you're thinking about eating well for your own mental health, thinking about sugar, thinking about protein, thinking about anti-inflammatory vegetables and omega-3 fats. And the other thing that I really should mention is that this approach of improving dietary patterns is not a replacement for other mental health treatments. For many of the people that I work with in my clinical practice, this is one part of their treatment plan. It's important, but there may be other tools that are necessary to support that individual. So for any listeners that are experiencing significant mental health symptoms, it's important to get assessed and to collaborate with a mental health professional, but also to think about, could nutrition be part of the strategy for supporting mental health for them?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So for those that are with us today that are feeling quite inspired, where do they get started? Like, what is something that, how can we inspire people that are just on the brink of getting on track with healthy eating? Like, what are some tips that you would recommend to maintain the lifestyle that we've, discussed through, that's backed by your research?
So I think accountability is important, whether that's
very good.
Like having somebody that you can report back to on your progress can make a difference. That might be a professional, or it might be someone in your life, maybe somebody who's also wanting to make some changes in their lifestyle behaviors. I think that writing things down can be a really helpful tool. As a researcher, we know that the act of writing down the food that you eat changes your eating behavior. And when you're trying to study nutrition, this is a total pain in the butt right. Because we really want to know what people are eating. But when you ask them to write it down, they change their behaviors. So it makes studying nutrition really hard. But for people looking to change their behavior, they can use it to their advantage, because that act of writing it down is a source of accountability. And we know that people will make different behavior choices if they know they have to report it.
Yeah, very great tip. And hey, a science-backed one, a research-backed one at that. So Dr. Aucoin, this has been an incredible episode. I've learned a lot. I've been able to track and follow along with what you've said, despite the fact that we're at very different spectrums of understanding of some of the scientific stuff that you're an expert in. I need that knowledge translation. I'm the recipient of those handouts that you are working towards. But you have so eloquently explained things, and I appreciate that so much. This is our last series, or last episode, and what's been a great series, Mind Your Melon. Just so thankful that some great farmers were able to come together and make this happen, and we've been able to get some incredible experts that have shared their opinions and their history and their research and their evidence with us. But I'll tell you what this series has taught me is we got to keep talking about mental health and that correlation of mind and food. So we're going to do the best we can here at the Produce Moms to weave that the Mind Your Melon concept into our ongoing programming as well. But Dr. Aucoin, just wow, thank you. You've been an incredible guest, a great show for us to wrap this series up with. And I'm so thankful that you were able to be part of this. But, we have a tradition, our guests get the final closing remarks and the final goodbye to our listeners at every show. But, I'm going to pass the mic back to you, but I also want you to share with folks how they can, if this research that you're doing, I mean, we'd love to have you back on, of course, but if there's a way where people can connect with you online, I'd love for you to share that in your closing remarks as well. So again, thank you for being here, and the mic is yours for the goodbye and any closing thoughts.
Thank you, Lori. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk about this work and raise awareness and start those conversations about food and mental health. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing at Produce Moms, which is a form of knowledge translation, communicating communicating to the public about the importance of eating fruits and vegetables. So if you'd like to connect with me, you can follow me on social media, or I have a website that has some more information about some of my research. And my takeaway really is thinking about food and how it's important for our physical health, but also our mental health. So thanks for having me. And that's it.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Produce Moms podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a featured guest, just send an email to lori@theproducemoms.com. We know there is a produce mom in you because there's a produce mom in all of us. Join our community on Facebook and all social platforms. Help us change the way America eats. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.